Would you like me to tell you how I came to get involved and start the Grizzly Bear Foundation? One day I was sitting by a river. It was up the BC coast. It was a sunlit glade, and I was watching this river. I was just quietly sitting there, and all of a sudden I smelt something, and I turned my head just sideways, and I found that I was looking right into the face of a grizzly bear. And the bear was just a foot or so away from my face. And I hadn't heard the bear come. So I was totally frozen. I just totally froze, and the bear was just stared at me with those big dark eyes. And then the bear ambled away and went upstream only about 12, 15 feet. And it sat down on its haunches and started to look at the river just the same way I'd been looking at the river. And the both of us were just sitting there staring into the river. And then what happened is I woke up. It was a dream.
Good evening. Welcome to Give for Grizzlies. Thank you for joining us on this cold December evening. Very soon, I hope that we can be together in person, but for now, we're finding creative ways to stay engaged with friends and supporters like you. I'm Nicholas Scapolati, and I'm the Executive Director of the Grizzly Bear Foundation, and I'll be your host this evening. I'm at home with my dog, Sitka. She just walked off, but she might pop in later. And just like you tonight, it's going to be pretty casual, as you can see. So please be patient with our technical ability. Sit back with a cup of holiday cheer and enjoy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm honored to be joining you this evening from the Tsleil-Waututh, the world birthplace and territory of the Seashell people in Pender Harbor. To acknowledge the lands that we're all joining from this evening, we have a special guest joining us. Please join me in welcoming Indigenous artist and advocate, Grizzly Bear Foundation board member, Laura Grizzly Paws. Hi, Laura.
Katwao. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us and opening the acknowledgement for our guests this evening. We're going to speak later on. You're going to be part of a panel, and I'm excited to have that discussion with you. But again, thank you for kicking off and acknowledging all of the places that people are joining us from this evening.
Absolutely. First of all, I would like to, with respect, honor, and integrity, I wish to acknowledge the Indigenous lands on which we all reside and settled on. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, from the Secwepemc to the St'át'imc to the Seneca to the Intlekatmuk, the Thompson, the Chilcotin, the Dakar, the Dene. From all landscapes, the land was considered a sacred part of identity of Indigenous peoples, but not only Indigenous peoples, but also to all animate, inanimate, the natural phenomenon, and the great grizzly itself. And so here we are at this meeting place, a place of which many call home, and the homeland of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have this opportunity to engage, to work, and to play on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples with our guests, with the community large and wide from near and far. And with that, I would just like to open with a prayer to do an honor of the land as well as our ancestry. Cook Shimkau and Colton Takasha, I Amakokokwa, Muta I Amish Bispapazat. Cook Shimkau Takami was shout, Takami and Hochin Squawk. Cook Shimkau Takami and Eilach, Takami o Grip Iltitmuka. Cook Shimkau Takam Stamp Welja to Tmukasha, the Ukamukasha, the Grip Kasha. In the prayer, we just acknowledge the land, the language, and the people of the land. We honor and give thanks to the four-legged, to the ones that fly, to the ones that swim, and give thanks to the ones that grow and slither from the land, to the ones that swim. We give thanks for the young and the old. We give thanks for the future generations, and we give thanks for all things. Takam Stam, Takam Shniknukwa. I'll hand that back over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you, Laura. That was wonderful. I'm so excited, and it's such a pleasure to work with you at the Grizzly Bear Foundation. And I'm excited that we're all here tonight together. And I'm not the only one here. We have a whole team behind the scenes working to make Give for Grizzlies possible. And we are here tonight together to celebrate the Grizzly Bear, provide you with an update on the work that we're doing, and raise funds to help us support our work as we look out for the welfare and the conservation of the grizzly bear. Now, Give for Grizzlies should run about just over an hour. You can watch the chat in the side of your Zoom window for important links on how you can find out more information and how you can engage tonight and make donations, bid on auction items, things like that, and what we're talking about. Tonight, we're going to hear more about the work we do, as well as a special panel of guests that will talk about the two-eyed seeing approach to conservation. And that'll be in the second half of tonight's program. You'll hear about how you can support our work, bid on our auction, and make a donation tonight. So registration for the auction takes a minute. So if you haven't already registered, please go to the website in a side window, register in advance. And about halfway through the program, we're going to break for about 5 minutes so that you can go check out the auction and make a donation and things like that. So to kick things off, I'd like to invite Taylor Green, our communications and outreach coordinator, to join me to provide an exciting update on our work from the field. Taylor.
Hi, Nicholas. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Taylor. Nice to see you. So where are you joining us from today?
I'm here in Whistler, BC, and I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Squamish and Lillooet nations. And being here in Whistler, I'm on the west side of the Sea to Sky Highway, which puts me within the area of the Squamish Lillooet grizzly bear population unit, which is one of the 5 threatened grizzly bear populations in Southwest BC, which are some of the most threatened grizzly bear populations in North America.
Right, and a lot of people don't know that this area is actually one of the most threatened in North America.
Yeah, this is a recovering population, which is exciting for me. They're slowly increasing in numbers close to home. And just above me here are Sprout and Rainbow Mountains, where there's quite an extensive alpine trail network. And there have been some closures of these hiking and mountain biking trails in recent years due to grizzly bear activity. Up there, there was a trail closure again this past fall. And actually the Grizzly Bear Foundation partnered with the Coast to Cascades Grizzly Bear Initiative to hire grizzly bear expert Lana Chirniello, who did an independent review of the municipality's grizzly conflict mitigation strategy, with the concern that these trails were planned and built in some important grizzly bear habitat without adequately considering grizzly bears and a good understanding of how they use the area.
Yeah,
so
that's pretty exciting. That's a pretty exciting work, that bringing that, like, you know, some people wonder what we do, like working in the field on coexistence, but also it's working in this political realm and bringing this information to council. And they've I don't know if a lot of people know this, but they responded very favorably. And I'm proud of the Whistler Council for doing that.
Yeah, and close to home for me, it brings up the important discussion of coexistence and conservation versus recreation. Like if we want to support grizzly bear recovery, keeping grizzlies in mind in trail planning and maybe rethink the expansion of trails. Like at what point have humans and recreation taken up enough space, and we should instead save and make space for wildlife because we enjoy these healthy, beautiful outdoor spaces because of a diversity of wildlife, including bears and all the habitat that they rely on and contribute to what all that represents.
Right. And I think a lot of people don't realize that we're seeing more grizzlies in the whole sea to sky corridor from Squamish, Whistler, and Pemberton. But this is like 20, 30 years in the making. It's been an endangered grizzly bear population for a long time. And so these indications are, these sightings are an indication of success and things that we have to prepare for and get ready, that we're going to have more grizzlies and we're going to have more healthier ecosystems because of the role they play as a keystone species. So one of those really interesting areas that people don't know is that Pemberton Valley is a grizzly bear hotspot. And you were recently there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you were doing up in the Pemberton Valley.
Yeah, Pemberton there, just north of Whistler. I was there a couple of weeks ago to join the Coast to Cascades Grizzly Bear Initiative on their coexistence and education efforts in the area. Yeah, beautiful valley, these agricultural lands that lie at the fracture of two threatened and recovering populations. And another GBF worked with Coast to Cascades again there a few years ago, commissioned the bear hazard assessment in the area to support grizzly bear recovery, increase connectivity, provide proactive management recommendations for coexistence. And on this recent visit, we engaged with residents and farmers who shared their stories, questions, and concerns about grizzly bears in the area. And we talked about how to coexist with bears, how important it is to prevent bears from accessing human food sources, crops like carrots and potatoes, and especially garbage around homes, because when bears get into garbage, that is a tragic death sentence for bears. So removing—
what's interesting, if I could just jump in for a second, what's interesting about that work is that we actually got support from the Ministry of Agriculture to do that work and of finding a way for farmers to coexist so that they're not losing crops when they're finding a way to coexist so with grizzly bears. So a lot of this work you're going to be doing is not just with residents, but mostly with farms, right? And did you just recently go up and meet a group of farmers?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Our recent visit a couple of weeks ago, we did meet some of the farmers themselves. And yeah, it was a really meaningful gathering, just all about learning to live with grizzlies as they recover in the area and to get an idea of what are the community's needs and how can communities be provided with education on bear safety and behavior, and then training and support for installing electric fencing.
Right, and people can find out more information about that on our website. That we have reports on how to coexist with grizzlies and non-lethal techniques like electric fencing. One thing that's really cool that you mentioned is that you said we're partnering with Coast to Cascades, and tonight people will hear that a lot. And that's really our approach to conservation, is partnership, working in partnership with First Nations, conservation organizations, the government. I'm a big believer that the conservation movement needs to work together. And that's a big part of what we do at the Grizzly Bear Foundation. So thanks for mentioning that. And so you were up there checking out a mama and two cubs. And that's a big part of your work too, is making sure that we don't have orphan cubs. But when they do get orphaned, we do have Project Rewild. And so you've been doing a little bit of work on that as well. Maybe you can tell people what Project Rewild is.
Yeah, and so this coexistence work that we were just talking about, it all connects to this orphan grizzly cub rewilding research, Project Rewild, because say it's a mother grizzly with cubs of the year. Firstly, there's the conservation importance of just how important one female grizzly bear is for a recovering population. And then the point that it's so much better to have this proactive management, keep family groups together. Cubs are so much better off with their mothers, the longer they can stay with their mothers. And the rewilding research is looking at the success and survival of orphaned cubs post-release and there can be some comparison there with the survival of cubs that stay with their mom.
Right. And so, you know, one of the things I love about this project, and Michael Dane, you know, I talked about when he first started the organization, is that we're here to look out for the welfare and the conservation of grizzly bears. And sometimes they can connect. And we're going to talk a little bit about how welfare and conservation can help the bigger picture together. But first, I think we have a great video with some of the footage you shot in the field that Lindsay's going to play for us right now.
It's calling me, like the rainbow, like the rainbow. It's calling me, like the rainbow, the rainbow. Like the rainbow, like the rainbow. It's calling me.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So maybe what we could, I could ask you a couple of questions about that work. That looks like quite the adventure you've been having. It looks like you were in a few different places across British Columbia in that video. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, you know, where you've been and why you were in these places.
Yeah, so I had quite a busy fall with some field work and travel for Project Rewild into some beautiful, spectacular areas. Grizzly bears live in some really amazing places. So that footage I captured that footage, but the person you saw there with the yellow jacket, that's Dr. Lana Chiarniello, who's the independent research scientist and principal investigator leading the Rewild research. And I've been supporting her as the project's principal technician.
Very cool work. That's amazing experience for you being able to be in the field. And you have a degree in wildlife biology, don't you, from McGill?
Yeah, I studied at McGill University, graduated in 2014. It was in environmental science, and I specialized in biodiversity and conservation. So for me to work with Lana, it's been a really special experience and opportunity for me to work closely with Lana, because for me, someone who new in their career and interested in bear conservation and research, Lana's like, she's up here.
Yeah. For those who don't know, right, Lana is IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. She's their lead, or their chair, I think, right now, of their bear working group. So pretty special. And that's another thing that we do here at the Grizzly Bear Foundation. We lead with science, and we make sure we work with top researchers in the field to further the research into grizzly bear conservation. So maybe you could tell us, you know, where exactly you were in those videos and what you were doing. It looked like you were searching for grizzlies across rugged habitat. And don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so those videos had some footage from Central Coast, around the Bella Coola area, and also in the West Kootenays. So in September, we were up in the Central Coast of BC to check on the orphan bears that were released out of Bella Coola this past spring. So those bears, they were rescued in fall of 2020, and they'd spent the winter at the Northern Lights Wildlife Shelter, which is the only wildlife shelter in North America that rescues and releases orphan grizzly bear cubs.
Right.
And so those bears had now been in the wild for 4 months. And so this research involves post-release monitoring, looking at the success and survival of the orphan bears. How well do these bears do out there? Do they survive? How do they use the landscape? And so that footage that's in the fall, Lana goes out to do a visual check of the bears, to check on their condition, check on their GPS collars, and she also conducts habitat assessments. So using the GPS collar data, she can identify cluster locations, areas where bears have spent a chunk of time. And she'll go into some of those areas, like the ones she can access, because sometimes these areas that the bears are in, the helicopters just can't land, which we experienced in some of the subalpine alpine areas around Bella Coola, and also weather is often a challenge with visibility. And you saw the snow in that video. It was already covered in snow, but in that area, we could actually see there was still a lot of blueberries, good for bears.
Yeah, so this is pretty cutting edge research, right? Up until this point, you know, the only rewilding program in British Columbia, in the world for grizzly bears, it's been happening here in BC, but once they were released, no one was really looking at, you know, analyzing their journey past release. You know, where were they accessing habitat? Were they being successful as young orphan cubs without their mamas? And what Lana's finding is really exciting, that they have natural techniques that they're figuring out how to dig and look for salmon, find the right berry patches and the right food. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the signs of, you know, what you've seen and how hopeful that is.
Yeah, so we'll see what her research says, but when she does these habitat assessments, she goes down on the ground and looks for signs of food that bears are eating, how they're using the habitat. She does her plant identification. Because we want to know, how are these bears using the land? Are they using the land effectively? And are they finding and utilizing food sources and seasonal habitats like wild bears? And it's a really interesting question of how much is innate in these bears, or how much can they figure out on their own or learn from other bears versus how much do they learn from their mothers? So yeah, this past fall, she made some pretty cool observations, which we'll be excited to see in her report.
Great. So, you know, this project goes on, and unfortunately, it was a hard year again for mama grizzlies, and we've got a number of orphan cubs that Northern Lights Wildlife Sanctuary is caring for right now, that are, you know, they're going to be rewilded next year. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about who's going to be in the program and next year.
There's currently 5 grizzly bears at the Northern Lights Wildlife Shelter, so they'll spend the winter there and then be released in the springtime.
Right, in different locations across BC. Well, we look forward to your update in the new year and more footage of your adventures. I want to just thank again to our partners at Northern Lights Wildlife Shelter, the great work that they're doing. And by developing a scientific understanding of how grizzly bear rewilding efforts are now and can be improved, we gain critical insight and information needed to inform best practices on grizzly bear management policy for orphan cubs across North America. And right now, wildlife officials in Alberta, in Montana, are looking very closely at this project. So beyond British Columbia and beyond the fate of these bears, it could have implications for orphan cubs across North America, and maybe even in brown bear populations in Europe. So the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the reasons we're here is to help support this work. And that project is very close to my heart for obvious reasons, but it's not possible without generous donors like you. And to continue this work, we need your help. And tonight, there's a lot of ways that you can give, thanks to some very generous artists, businesses, individuals, and especially the Adane Foundation. The first way to give is our online auction. So if you get a chance to check it out, it's been up for a couple of weeks. It'll actually be open until tomorrow night at 9 p.m. So there's still some time to bid and, you know, have a little competition with some friends or other donors. The links are in the chat and you can find it out on the website. And we've got a special video to tell you a little bit about the prizes and the people who are so generous with their support.
Hello, my name is Matthias Horn, and I'm an artist based on the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. My work is dedicated to shining light on important species and ecosystems in an effort to support conservation and education initiatives. I see my artwork sitting at the confluence of art and science by collaborating with environmental organizations, photographers, and scientists to provide a platform for research and education. Over 2 years now, I have worked to support the Grizzly Bear Foundation by creating paintings to help communicate and fund the importance of grizzly protection here in North America. One notable project that I'm so grateful to be a part of is an exhibit organized by the Bateman Foundation Gallery titled Grizzly Bears, Teachers of the Land. Something notable about this collection and my own artwork is that I'll never represent grizzly bears in an aggressive way. For me, I have witnessed far too often a man conquers nature narrative throughout history, art, and even environmentalism. And I'm really interested in challenging this notion through my art by turning misunderstanding and fear into empathy and connection. In doing so, I hope to foster more awareness and support towards wildlife organizations making a difference. Collaboration is really the best step we have at making a difference in wildlife populations here in Canada. So I hope that you join me in supporting the Grizzly Bear Foundation. Let's make a difference. Thank you.
I'm always so moved by the generosity of others to help nature, and 100% of the proceeds will go to the Grizzly Bear Foundation, which is pretty amazing. So as I mentioned, there's 3 ways to give. So one is our art auction, and lots of items out there for you to look at, potential gifts for the holidays. The other way is to become a Grizzly Guardian. And so right here, I've got my Grizzly Guardian. For those who don't know, these are our plushies, and each bear represents one of the 14,000 grizzlies estimated in British Columbia. And so by becoming a Grizzly Guardian, you'll actually get a little number that you can find out where your bear represents in the province. And there's also a non-consumptive version too. So it's a great stuffy, put under the Christmas tree, but also a great way to give someone a little conservation for Christmas. Put him back there. So besides becoming a Grizzly Guardian, another great way to double your impact is to make a donation tonight. And we have some exciting news. To make your donation even more impactful, thanks to a match from the Adane Foundation, your impact will be doubled, because every dollar that you give for Grizzlies tonight will be matched up to $30,000 by the Adane Foundation, which is very exciting. And I hope you'll join in and help us reach our goal tonight to match the full $30,000. So tonight we need your help. We need your support to protect grizzly bears, to address the threats they face, to do the field research needed to further conservation, to engage communities in coexistence, to support Indigenous-led conservation, which we're going to hear a little bit more about tonight, and to protect habitat and food sources wherever grizzly bears may roam. So grizzly bears capture our hearts and our imaginations. They're in our stories and our myths. They are iconic symbols of the wild, but they need our help. They need allies like you. And tonight we're asking you to please give for Grizzlies. So go to our website, add a comment that says match my gift, to ensure that the Adane Foundation matches your gift tonight. And now we're going to take a little break so you can go and do that. You can grab a drink, check out the auction, and please make a donation to support our work. And we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your support. There will be time again to give and bid later. And as I mentioned, the auction will be open until tomorrow at 9 p.m. Pacific time. So this is a very special part of tonight's event, Give for Grizzlies. We have a panel joining us to have a conversation about the two-eyed seeing approach to conservation, working through science and Indigenous knowledge. This conversation will last about 30 minutes and take us through to the end of the evening, but please stay with us because we have another special video to share with you at the end. To kick this off, this important conversation, we have a short video share with you. And we're going to run that now. Recently, the Grizzly Bear Foundation updated our mission statement. And for those who don't know and haven't seen it on our website, the Grizzly Bear Foundation is a charitable organization dedicated to the welfare of the grizzly bear across North America. Guided by science and Indigenous knowledge, we work collaboratively to support the conservation of grizzly bears through research, public education, and advocacy. And then, although this has been an important part of my career, very important to Michael Ledane as the founder, it wasn't officially recognized in our mission statement that we do work closely with First Nations, Indigenous communities, and that Indigenous knowledge is as important for us in decision-making on conservation as science. And so that's where the idea of this two-eyed seeing approach comes from. So this was an important step for us to further conservation through reconciliation. But what is Indigenous knowledge? Or some people call it traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, you may have heard of that. Why is it important to work through both knowledge systems? And it comes down to what are these knowledge systems? And it was recently put to me in a way that really changed my understanding. Science is this 4,000-year-old way of knowing the world through the scientific method that's been standardized across the world, across geography and culture. It's very powerful. And Carl Sagan called science a candle in the dark. However, it's also very limited because it is a snapshot and it removes emotion from the work. Indigenous knowledge, another knowledge system, stretches back tens of thousands of years. It is place-based and it is embedded in cultures, language, art, and the responsibility for the stewardship of nature. And I believe that Indigenous knowledge is a light in the world. Science is struggling to find ways to solve the ecological crisis, but together, I believe that Indigenous knowledge and science, working together, we can find our way. That's why we're here tonight. We have an amazing panel to talk about a two-eyed seeing approach to conservation, working through science and Indigenous knowledge. And tonight, we have some truly amazing and dedicated conservationists joining us, and they should be coming online. You'll just be able to see their pictures up soon. We have Richard Sparrow, our new director of Indigenous-led conservation at the Grizzly Bear Foundation, and a member and counselor of the Musqueam Nation. We have Jennifer Walkus, a researcher and member and counselor of the Wiikino Nation. She's authored a number of papers supported by the Grizzly Bear Foundation, and she's recently published a paper on the link between grizzly bear genetics and First Nation language groups on the coast. Some of you might have heard that. Wonderful, wonderful research. Dr. Faisal Mullah is joining us from the University of Guelph, and his work with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And Faisal was an important advisor in the foundation of the Grizzly Bear Foundation. In case people haven't seen it, Michael Ledane has published a new book, memoirs, and in there gives a nice shout out to Dr. Faisal Mullah for his help in consulting and building the Grizzly Bear Foundation. Laura Grizzly Paz is with us, who did our welcome at the beginning, which is wonderful. She's an Indigenous artist, advocate, Grizzly Bear Foundation board member, and she's currently doing educational developer of Indigenous teaching and learning at Thompson River University. Douglas Nislas is the chief counselor of the Kitasoo-Hayhays Nation, a member of the BC's Ministers Advisory Council, and also a Grizzly Bear Foundation board member. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with all of you this evening. Thank you for joining us. Nice to see you all. I hope you're having a good time and you're as cozy as I am here. We got the fire going. I think Sikla's back.
You're looking pretty comfy there.
Yeah. Wanted to keep it a little more casual this year. I know everyone's in their comfy pants, so. So we've got a number of questions for each of you, just so our guests can get to know you and your work, and then we'll break into like a discussion together. But to start off, I'd actually like to start with Richard. Richard, maybe you can tell us where you're joining us from, and then can you tell us, for people who don't know, what is Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge?
Thanks, Nicholas. It's an honor. It's an honor to participate tonight, and I thank you for your question. And I also want to thank Laura for her welcome today. As Nicholas indicated, my name is Richard Sparrow, and I'm the director of Indigenous-led conservation with the Grizzly Bear Foundation. My traditional name is Tlaquiltuth, and I'm a member and counselor of the Musqueam First Nation. And it's an honor to call in today from the traditional territory of the Hunkaminam speaking people. First and foremost, traditional knowledge, in my view, it shouldn't be something that is confusing or perhaps intimidating. It's something that should be embraced and acknowledged as an asset. Indigenous peoples have been passing down this knowledge for thousands of years, as you indicated. Recently, one of my elders in my community explained to me his perspective on Indigenous knowledge, and he explained it to me in this way, that it's like seeing with your ears and hearing with your eyes. Indigenous knowledge is really a reflection of thousands of years of Indigenous history, culture, and traditions that is all intertwined by Indigenous language. Indigenous peoples have been passing down knowledge and through oral history for thousands of years, as you indicated, and it highlights experiences, past practices, historical events, governance, and laws. I feel very fortunate to have worked with most communities in British Columbia, and each time I'm so very impressed with the wealth of knowledge and experience and understanding of the issues and the opportunities that take place within their traditional territory. My work with the Grizzly Bear Indigenous Roundtable, I'm very lucky that it's comprised of Indigenous delegates who bring forward their perspectives in a manner that allows the Grizzly Bear Foundation to act as a resource to convene and elicit and distill information to advance conservation goals and objectives. I'm extremely proud to work with our Indigenous partners, and I thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about my perspective and what traditional knowledge is. And I feel very grateful for the opportunity to continue to learn.
Thanks, Rich. It's wonderful. Thank you for your answer, and I look forward to engaging with you in a few minutes on the bigger group. I'd like to introduce everyone to Jen Walkus. And Jen, maybe you could tell us where you're joining us from this evening. And then also, can you tell us about your exciting research and how you worked through science and Indigenous knowledge to make this discovery?
Hi, my name is Jen Walkus. I'm coming to you from Port Hardy today. I'm on my way home to the Wiikinook Nation, but I'm in Gwasala, Kwagilt, and Quatsino Nation, or Gwasala, Nakwachta, Quatsino and Kwagilt territories. And we've been, a little bit about me, I guess. I come from Rivers Inlet. It's Wiikinook village of Katit. It's a really small community, about 60 to 80 people. We have anywhere from about 6 to in the mid-20s Grizzlies that live in and around the village at any one point in time. So our way of life is a lot more defined by our relationship to Grizzlies than most places would be, where we really started making some major changes and trying to decide how we were going to bring Western science and traditional ecological knowledge together was after we had a salmon collapse in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And the first year started out, we had 300,000 salmon coming in, sockeye salmon alone. The next year we came back with something like about 5,000. And so when you have an magnitude drop of that size, it means that all of the cubs that were produced expecting to have enough fish for them the year before, all of a sudden there's not enough fish for the mature grizzlies, much less enough fish for the mothers and the fathers and everything else that's living there. And so in that year, we ended up shooting something like about 15 grizzlies in the community. And these are grizzlies people had grown up seeing, like we're really accustomed to having grizzlies in and around the community. So this really was a huge burden on the community. So we started trying to figure out, how do we change the way we do things to make it so that we can coexist a lot better with grizzlies within our own lives. And so we do garbage pickup 3 times a week during fish season, because we'll all have fish guts, everything else like that. We had fenced a dump, but it's really hard to keep bears out of even a fenced dump. It's next to impossible, especially when you've got grizzlies the size of ours. And so coming up in this next year, we're going to start shipping our garbage out to the island. We've come up with a partnership with Vancouver Island, and we're going to do a lot more of the recycling and the composting and ship what's left out here. And so once we started finding that out, we knew just how closely tied salmon and bears and the Wiikinuk really were. And so we started trying to figure out, how do we make sure there's enough food for us, make sure there's enough food for bears, make sure that we know how many bears are around. Because all of these were questions that DFO didn't take into consideration when they were managing salmon. And that was one of the biggest concerns that we had, is they only managed salmon based on how much fish were needed in the commercial fishery. They didn't count how many fish came through our river, and the salmon counts came through Dosey Fence, which is the next inlet down. And so we started trying to figure out how, if we were in charge, how would we do things better? Where would we find the money to do things better? And how do we develop the partnerships to get to that point? And so we started first working within our AFS agreement. We have what's called a CPUE index to try and determine how many fish are going by, catch per unit effort. So you do a few drifts and you count how many fish are in those drifts. You do the same number of drifts every day. And depending on how many you catch in a day, that tells you how many fish you've got. But that didn't get us to where we needed to be. And we'd seen some work that was taking place out in the with the Heiltsuk Nation out in Quay, which is a territory that's the homeland of one of our families as well. And so they were working with Rain Coast, and they were trying to look at numbers for grizzlies in the Quay watershed. We wanted to do the same thing within the whole of the Owakino Lake Rivers Inlet watershed. And so we partnered with Rain Coast as well.
And this is the research that the Grizzly Bear Foundation helps support.
Yep, it is. And so it's that research was earlier on, started out looking at, it's what's called a hair snare analysis. And so you take this nice big pile of debris, so branches, whatever else is around, toss it all in the middle, put a nice little barbed wire fence around it, and then you pour something really fishy and smelly on the inside. So that way, and then you put a pie plate with a piece of cloth up on it, dumped in the same thing. And so then the bears can smell it. It drifts on the currents in the air. And so then the bear comes in to check it out. And as it comes to check it out, it climbs over the barbed wire fence, and you get this little tuft of hair that pulls out. And when a bear comes up in the spring, it's losing all of its hair with the full year from the year before. So that way it'll give you a lot more information. It's a full year's growth. So it'll tell you what kind of nutrients it's getting, whether they're marine or terrestrial. Terrestrial will have a different nitrogen isotope than the marine ones. So it's a good way to find out what percentage of the fish's diet is fish. It's a good way to tell how stressed they are, whether they're male, female, pregnant. So you can learn a lot just from a piece of hair.
Right. And then how did you incorporate Indigenous knowledge into this? You know, it's basically a scientific investigation to collect DNA, and how did the two work together?
It started out with the questions that we had wanted, because when we first started working with Megan Adams, who is our researcher, we only had her for a master's. Master's is supposed to be 2 years. And so we had some questions. We knew that we were running into problems with bears, and we knew that we wanted to know how much fish bears needed so that we could make sure that that there's enough provided for them. And we knew that we wanted to know how much that we needed. And so we had this list of questions, a bunch of which she wasn't going to get to answer because she was only doing a master's. Partway through her research, and these were the questions that had come out of meetings, extensive meetings with our community. Before she even decided what her master's questions were, she came in and she worked with us in the village. And so she asked the community what their concerns were. What do we need to know? What do we know? What are our knowledge gaps? And how do we get to where we want to manage properly? So one of the questions that we had first was, how many bears are there? Because we knew after the salmon collapse that we had lost a lot of grizzlies. We knew the ones that were shot in the community, and we also knew there was a bunch that had died in the bush just because they starved. And so we wanted to know how much there were. How worried did we have to be? And we needed to know how much they ate, because if we knew how many fish were coming, then we could have an idea just what are the likelihoods we're going to run into these kinds of problems. And so when she had these questions, she started looking at how do we find that within our research. And she came back and told us first, well, we can't figure out how much fish bears need because we don't have the data yet. We're only doing 2 years worth of data. We're not going to have a long enough time series to find out whether and how many bears there are, plus how many fish there are, and get to the point where we can answer that question.
Right.
But when it came down to it, she got so invested in the kind of work that she did, and working with us, and the amount of work that she did with our community, because she didn't just come in and work for a week or two. She came in for 2.5, 3 months. She would come out with our school children. We used to do camera traps just around the community. And so she would take the kids out, show them the different kinds of bear signs, show them all of these things that they don't get. Like the thing about a school in our community, we only have something like about anywhere between 6 and 10 kids, and all elementary school, because we don't have a high school. Our kids have to go out to high school. So this is the first time our kids get exposed to anything that shows them where their priorities are being taken into account when they're doing the research.
So it sounds like not only is the research happening, but Indigenous knowledge is guiding the research questions, basically, because your community lived in coexistence for so long. But it's also creating new opportunities to further Indigenous knowledge in a new generation of kids.
Yeah, and definitely getting a lot of interest. It's really hard right now to compete with kids' attention with video games, with TV. If you've got kids, you know how hard it is to do.
Yeah. And don't get them one for Christmas.
Yeah.
Take them outside.
Having Megan go out with the kids and show them in the field what science can be like. We're hoping it's going to help us develop a whole new generation of scientists and traditional ecological knowledge keepers who are able to work with both the traditional ecological knowledge and the Western science to be able to see where those gaps are in between. One of the biggest problems that I've always seen.
Yeah. I was going to just interrupt you there for a sec, because I think that that's really interesting, is that, this isn't an easy path, right? It's like, working in science, we know there's challenges to conservation. You've kind of outlined the challenges with that. And I want to follow up with you a little bit and when we get into the group discussion, but I'd like to just switch to Douglas Niesloss a little bit, because you worked very closely with Douglas. And he's experienced some of these challenges of how we can bring together science and Indigenous knowledge so that they're accepted beyond the community and the work they're doing there. Nice to see you, Douglas. Where are you calling from tonight?
Oh, hello. I'm calling from Clem 2, the Kitasoo Nation on Central Coast of BC.
Wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit about, you're on the Great Bear Rainforest Bear Working Group. You're recently on the Minister's Advisory Council. I think you might have an update for us on that. Taking this two-eyed seeing approach isn't always easy, as we heard from Jen, but can you tell us a little bit about the challenges you faced, but also maybe, some of the successes that have come out of that work?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be a part of this group. It's really good to have a group just dedicated to Indigenous people and able to share some stories. I guess I have a long background in ecotourism. When I was 17 years old, I started up an ecotourism operation up here in my community. This is just coming off the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement. So we wanted a long-term sustainable industry. So we put a lot of time and effort in building that. As we were building this operation, we were competing with trophy hunters. So we watched a lot of the hunters come in and shoot these bears for a sport, which was a major issue. And so that's kind of propelled my life into helping protect bears. As we kind of moved along, we ran into a lot of challenges. The provincial government has a legal obligation to protect grizzly bear habitat, but they don't do a lot of work around it, and they do these flights that are based on these habitat models. I remember they were missing big chunks of their data. We told them there's grizzly bears all over the islands. They're missing data for all the islands, and they said, there's no grizzly bears out there. And they asked what evidence I had. And I said, I got photos, I got videos, I got GPS. I said, what do you guys want? I'll send it over. And they basically said, you're not a scientist, you're not a biologist, and you can't be making these sort of allegations. And then they also said, some people don't know the difference between a grizzly bear and a black bear. And I said, well, I've been working with bears for more than half my life, both as a creek walker, counting salmon, as an eco-tour guide. And so we knew that we had to start doing a bunch of work trying to gather this data, but we knew that we knew it because we live with these bears, and we've always had stories about bears and where they live, so we knew we had lots of knowledge to share. Just kept on running into these roadblocks around Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, and it's really unfortunate because I think First Nations have a lot to share about bears. I mean, we've lived with them for thousands of years. They're in our stories, they're in our songs, they're in our dances, they're in our clan systems. And unfortunately, I would say in most places, Indigenous knowledge is not accepted as a form of knowledge. And so that's something that we're pushing on multiple fronts more and more. And, when I think about science, what is science? Science is observation over time. And that's exactly what Indigenous people have. We've been here for thousands of years. We pass on the knowledge from generation to generation. And, we have a lot to share. But unfortunately, that's not reflected in the management or the policies. If you look at the Wildlife Act, it was developed in the late 1800s by hunters, for hunters, with no First Nations input. And that's still true for 2021. So.
Right. And, I'd like to thank you for being part of our, one of the advisors on our Indigenous Roundtable for grizzly bear conservation. And that's one of the things we're working to tackle. And we've got a meeting coming up next week where we bring together nations from across BC and the Yukon to talk about these issues. And the Grizzly Bear Foundation supports that work. Rich mentioned he's doing that. So hopefully we can address some of those concerns together, Douglas, and thanks for your leadership on that. I think it's just wonderful, what you said there, Douglas, the knowledge is in the stories, it's in the dances, it's in the songs. And then I've had this explained to me by Mike Willey, a friend of the Grizzly Bear Foundation. This is title. These are the data sets, if you will. This is the evidence, and it's intertwined in the culture. And to segue into that, I'd like to talk to Laura about this. Laura is a performer, and she's working at the university. And when I first mentioned this idea of the two-eyed seeing approach to Laura, she said to me right away, walking in two worlds with one spirit. And I love that. And what you do in your community, what you do with Grizz as a performer, can you tell us a little bit about how Indigenous knowledge comes through in grizzly bear conservation and engaging people through the stories you tell and the performances that you deliver to people? I think you're muted there, Laura, still.
Unmute myself.
There you go.
There I am. So yeah, thank you. Kuksum. It's great to be here, to be amongst each and every one of you, just to listen and learn. From my experiences, one of the greatest strengths of the resilience of who we are as Indigenous peoples is that knowledge sharing between bears and people. And that goes back to our creation stories about what demonstrates the resilience of who we are as a people. Elders have passed on stories about people watching and learning from bears as they may eat many of the same things that are also omnivores, and bears and people both learn from their ancestors what to eat and where to go, places to go to attract food sources or staple. And also one of the things that's really unique and authentic about that is that bears also have their genetics. I've heard just previously, you talking about the different genetics of bears, and they have their home ranges, they have their territories, and they have their mothers, just as Indigenous families and traditional people have the rights to manage specific parts of their territories, their lands, their resources, and to exercise that through their title and their rights. And so these are like familiar links, family links to territories, sharing of knowledge, managing, and also sustainability of resources. And so when we look at our creation stories, and our creation stories date back to countless generations since beyond time immemorial, where the relationship between the creator and the animal kingdom and the people was determined and based out of that reciprocal relationship, that reciprocity. The grizzly bear first stated that she was going to teach the women how to give birth to their young, and also teach them about how to live in harmony with the natural ecology and places to go for food, shelter, and from high, mid, low elevations, from the rivers to the streams, to the berries, to the roots, to the salmon, which is a huge part of our diet. Like salmon is 70% of our diet as a people. And I'm from the Stratling territory, where a central interior British Columbia people, and salmon is a huge staple. And we used to have the largest spring salmon grounds within the world, and such a strong, rich resource. And we used to be known as the smiling people because of the abundance of salmon that we would harvest from our waters. But when we're looking at global warming, we're looking at the impacts that's happening to the environment. We're looking at the impacts of the development of the dams. All of these things are impacting we as a people, but also when we think about what is central, we need to also align conservation practices with Indigenous peoples, pairing local traditional ecological knowledge with Western to create that change or that impact about our knowledge systems and our wisdom that has been passed down for countless generations is so important and such an integral part of sustainability. Because when we look at sustainability or protection and security of the bears, we also must look at how one species can impact another. And salmon is one of the hugest ones. Like, if we're looking at a web of life and we have salmon, trees, bears, roots, deer, elk, owls, the ones that slither, the ones that crawl, the ones that grow, all those things that I acknowledged in the opening prayer, if something happens to the salmon, that impacts the bears. The bears harvest the salmon, the carcass is hauled out of the river, carried and pathed on the trails of the grizzly bear, and then parts of the carcass is is decaying on the earth, which feeds the roots, the berries, the trees, the medicines, all of these things that also feed and nourish the people, the animals, the winged ones, the ones that crawl, you know, so it creates a huge rippling effect of that interconnectedness. And that's that relationship. Like when we think about reciprocity, the Indigenous worldviews is at the heart of maintaining the appropriate relationships we have with all elements in the natural world, both animals and humans. And to appropriate human-animal relationships, you know, we need to be considerate. We need to think about every choice and decision that we're making, because every choice and decision we make in regards to conservation, preserving, harvesting, extracting is going to impact future generations. So we're always thinking about past generations, 7 generations into the past and 7 generations into the future. So every choice that we make impacts past through our present actions that reflects what would become the outcome of the future generations.
Right, and that's the value that comes into working through both knowledge systems, not only place-based knowledge that comes from history, but also that value side that we so obviously need as we face this, you know, biodiversity crisis and this climate crisis. And, you know, Douglas mentioned some of the good work that he's been doing to work through that. And Laura, you've just so eloquently, you know, described how that works. I'd like to call on Faisal Mullah, Dr. Faisal Mullah from the University of Guelph and the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, about how conservation organizations are working through science and Indigenous knowledge to further conservation and this unique partnership program. Faisal, how are you doing?
Yeah, thanks. I apologize, I'm gonna have to, my camera's off because I've got very poor internet here. But yeah, I think you know, one of the things that I discovered when I moved from working with folks like Douglas and Jennifer and joined the University of Guelph is a recognition that, as my colleague, Indigenous fisheries scientist Andrea Reed has said, that Western science has not only taken precedence over Indigenous knowledge systems and conservation and other areas of public policy, but it's tended to reinforce the embedded power imbalances to the detriment of local Indigenous communities. And this only serves to strengthen Western science for its own ends and to concentrate, in many cases, power in the administrative centers rather than the Indigenous communities themselves. And you know, we've heard 4 examples here of the richness of community-led stewardship of grizzly bears and nature and such. And we're beginning to shift now where I think there's a greater interest in a coexistence and complementarity of both Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. And it's happening through the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas by Indigenous peoples, Indigenous guardians networks, for example, the protection of sacred sites, sacred forests, in which Indigenous knowledge is explicitly being used to inform conservation decision-making. And I think this is really important because colonial conservation policy and science, you know, has long reinforced, I think, a very misguided belief that the management expertise of nature should exclusively be informed by Western science. You know, we heard from Douglas speak about how, based on his observations and his community's observations, they knew there were grizzly bears on these outer islands. And here he's being told by a government bureaucrat, well, you're not a scientist. I mean, how ridiculous is that? You know, the other thing I wanted to say, if I could just mention just a few words here, is that, you know, I think one of the things I've learned as a non-Indigenous person, I'm not Indigenous to this country. My family and my community, we're also colonized people. We were colonized by the British and the Dutch in Southern Africa, but we are settlers to this country. We came as refugees to this country. But one of the things I've realized working with Douglas and Jennifer and others is that Indigenous peoples have been protecting nature and biodiversity and wildlife since time immemorial through their own cultural and their legal and their own economic and their own knowledge systems and their own forms of conservation governance. And that includes, as I mentioned, these protection of sacred sites and tribal parks and such. And what's really unique about this approach to conservation is that it not only upholds the longstanding relationships and the customary practices of Indigenous peoples that benefit nature, but it also protects and stewards the cultural diversity, the cultural richness of their communities, which, as Laura spoke so eloquently about, in many cases are encoded in the art and the dance and the music and the other cultural expressions of their nations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. I'm just going to pause for a minute just to let everyone know we've got such a great panel here, and I haven't even gotten to my group question. And I just love hearing from all of you. So I'd like to just let people know that we're going to continue for a few more minutes. If they're interested in this conversation, please stay. And the auction is open. Please make a donation tonight. We greatly appreciate your support. And a big part of what we're doing here tonight is to support the work we do to further Indigenous-led conservation. And so we're going to come back in a minute, and I'm going to just put that to our panelists. So when you get a chance, please check out the auction, make a donation. And as I said, the auction will be open till tomorrow night at 9 p.m. We've got a lot of people on the line. I wanted to thank you all for attending. And our donations are going up in the bids. And so there's a lot of energy tonight that we appreciate you being a part of that. And right now I'm going to go back to this wonderful conversation, and I'm going to ask our panel, what can Indigenous knowledge teach us about grizzly bear conservation and coexistence? So as the Grizzly Bear Foundation, and just, raise your hand or take your mute off if you'd like to particularly answer that. It's kind of, where does this lead for us? Like, what's the value? Laura.
All right. So basically, I think about that, and I think that it goes back to that reciprocity about, that mutual respect in regards to our relationship to the grizzly bear and to the people. So, just a prime example of when we go to the river to harvest the salmon early in the morning, before that sunrise peaks over that mountain, and we're harvesting our salmon, we're harvesting our resources. And then the grizzly, we do that in the morning first thing, and because the grizzly bears or the bears are coming in the afternoon or into the evening. So when they're there, we leave.
That's a great coexistence story.
So that's what I think about that reciprocity.
Yeah.
Shared responsibility.
Oh, that's wonderful. So we're actually supporting some of that work in the Taku, where we're supporting the Taku Atlan Conservancy and working with Indigenous elders to tell stories, to share their Indigenous knowledge about how traditionally the community lived in coexistence with grizzly bears at different times of years. It's very similar to what you mentioned there, Laura. Jen, would you like to share your thoughts on that, where this might lead? And
we've got a couple of projects ongoing right now. One of the things that was important to us is that as we run into areas where bears don't have enough to eat, we're all having salmon problems, and all of the grizzlies on the coast are very much salmon driven. So one of the things we started looking at is, how do we try and figure out how to provide food if we don't have salmon, not just for us, but for the grizzlies as well? And so we're working with a researcher looking at how do we reinvigorate some of our crabapple groves. So most of the old villages had a crabapple grove or two associated with them because we ate a lot of those traditionally. Mm-hmm. And they come ripe at around the same time that the salmon would be coming back. And when we don't have enough salmon, we end up with bears coming into the village. So we started looking at reinvigorating those groves to provide an alternate food source that's outside of the village, so they don't actually come into the community where we end up having problems.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You're basically setting up a grocery store for these bears. So if they're like, hey, where's the salmon? And they're running into a wall of crabapple, and it's a great coexistence technique.
And it's just trying to figure that out, but it's also looking at one of the other research questions that we had looked at with Megan was, how do we plan for salmon for not just people, but for bears? So we started looking at some of the science around how do we make sure there's enough food left in the river so that the bears are taken care of once we know how many bears are there and how many fish are coming. And so that was a really big part of the research, was trying to figure out how do we make sure there's enough food, not just for us. Because one of the biggest concerns that I had is when we don't plan for bears and the predators in the system, it's the stream that suffers. Because if there are more bears than we're expecting and there's not as many fish as we're expecting, then those more bears are going to eat what little fish is there. Right. And so we have to find a better way to figure out how many fish are within the system, how many predators are within the system, and actually plan for that before we start taking our commercial fisheries out. Otherwise, that's how we end up fishing down the food chain, is because we're taking more than we know because we aren't taking these into account. Right. And so these ideas that you need to plan for more than, Western science is very siloed. Fish managers manage fish, bear managers manage bears. And for us, that's just not the way it works. And so that partnership between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge means that we're both able to speak from our strengths, and we're able to create a better system when both views are taken into account rather than just one, because both of them have their shortcomings. And when we work together, then it's like a Venn diagram. We're a lot stronger in this area where we work together than we are where those ones usually are the ones that fall off the table.
And that's wonderful. Besides a wonderful way to live in coexistence with these, grizzly bears that you've known for generations, it also drives biodiversity. You get bigger trees, which sequester more carbon, which make healthier streams that produce more salmon. And it's that view of conservation that, I think is the value of working through both knowledge systems. I see Faisal has got his hand there. Yep.
It also takes into account, government is supposed to take into account traditional ecological knowledge, but they have never put in the work to try and figure out how to do it. So when we get together with Western science and we figure out how to put our data in a way that government can't refute, that means that it takes away that argument that, well, we have no way to include it. So we gathered it all, but that's all we can do. Sorry, it doesn't fit. Well, that isn't the case anymore.
That's a great question. And I know Douglas wants to speak to that question because we talked a little bit about that earlier and the challenges he's facing. So Faisal, if it's okay, we can just hold your question, or did you? Yeah. So Douglas, I know that recently you've been challenged. You're on the Ministers Advisory Council and you're having that challenge that Jen is talking about, getting them to accept Indigenous knowledge, gone out and done the work on the science. How's that going, working with the government and bringing Indigenous knowledge into their decision making?
I think it's good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work that's going on. There's a lot of good people on the table. They're coming up with a new strategy called Together for Wildlife Strategy, where they're engaging First Nations. So that's really good. I find it a bit challenging sometimes when you have pro hunters that don't necessarily understand the cultural aspects or understand the respect that First Nations have for wildlife. And so yeah, it is a bit challenging for sure sometimes, but I think we're pushing and moving forward, and I think we have to. If the policies don't change, we're always going to have the problems on the ground. And so that's been a strong focus of our office, is that's where we want to put a lot of our effort in changing the policies. And we want to have we need to indigenize some of these policies, and that's the way I see it. So yeah, we're doing that now.
I'm looking forward to the Grizzly Bear Roundtable on grizzly bear conservation being a big part of that. Faisal, do you want to jump in with your question or your point?
Yeah. So the lab that I run at the University of Guelph is made up of Indigenous students and scholars and non-Indigenous students and scholars like myself. And one of the things that we're doing is exactly what Douglas spoke about, is trying to figure out how do we indigenize Canadian policy so that it better upholds the rights and title of Indigenous people, but also makes for better conservation. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot of work on is this idea of cultural keystone species. And I think sort of all of the Indigenous speakers sort of alluded to the idea that grizzly bears are not just ecological keystone species. Laura spoke about how they, are a vector for marine-derived nutrients by dragging the carcasses of grizzly bears. They literally are like gardeners. They're fertilizing the rainforest so that the trees grow bigger and better. But we also know that they are a cultural keystone species. They are an integral part of the identity and the culture of Indigenous peoples, not just on the west coast of what we call British Columbia today, but all the way across the country, where as far east as when grizzly bears at one point were found as east as the prairies. But one of the things that we discovered was that government oftentimes will reluctantly protect the animal or the plant that's a cultural keystone species, but not protect the relationship or uphold the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with that species. And it's inherently that relationship that people have with that species that makes it a cultural keystone species. And probably the best example I can give you is around the suppression of the Indigenous use of fire. One of the things we know is that Indigenous peoples have had very sophisticated methods of managing the ecosystem to create habitat for bears and other wildlife, for berries, and for themselves. And yet the cultural use of fire remains banned under colonial policy and law. The absence of fire actually detrimentally impacts both the animals and the plants and the communities that depend on those animals and the plants. So when Douglas talks about this idea of decolonizing policy, what I'd really like to see is some of the cultural characteristics and attributes, recognized and upheld and respected by these colonial governments. Thank you.
That's a wonderful point. And I think that, it's something we'll be talking about at our roundtable next week. And Laura, do you want to speak to that?
I just wanted to, oh, sorry, am I mute?
I can hear you. No, it's great.
Okay. I just wanted to, because it just sparked like some of the content regarding to indigenization is that what is really primarily important is that it's developed with local Indigenous communities with the input of them, and then that Indigenous scholars, academics, doctors, scientists, etc., have that input. Even our elders and our mentors within the territory and their communities, because they are the ones with the vast amount of knowledge of that. And then basically moving forward in regards to getting things approved by governing bodies or board of governors or political agents, and building that strong ally with Indigenous community members, establishing that community relationship with Indigenous communities is so important. And even developing some kind of an advisory committee council in regards to protecting the sacred is something. And I think that in order to indigenize something, you have to deconstruct or decolonize something that has not been working for, to accelerate progress and sustainability. And we've heard it time and time again, is that relationship of everything's interconnected.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that spurred something in Jen, and Jen wanted to make a comment as well.
Just talking about that cultural aspect and that relation between bears and people, that's one of the things that came out in that latest language paper that you were talking about earlier. Right. Yeah. The idea that bears and people, the language paper, if anyone hasn't seen it, talks about how the interrelatedness of bears, a lot of the work that we do is DNA related. And so they started looking at how related different bears were within the research that we had. And one of the things that they found is that the largest overlap that they had with the interrelatedness of bears, so these bears are most related to these bears, those bears are most related to those bears, those bears are most related to those bears. The biggest overlap was the language families. So we have like the Waukeshan families, which is us and the Heiltsuk. There's the Kitasoo they have their language families, and the Nukok have their language families. And these were the groups that the bears were the most interrelated within. And so one of the things that we had thought is that most of these probably come from the fact that, as was mentioned earlier, we learned a lot from bears. We have a lot of similar needs. We're all omnivores. We both have a need for a large amount of space to call our own when we're all within one community. And so when that happens, then it means that those bears will tend to stay within that territory. But one of the things that it brings up around policies is the idea that most of the bear management units are huge. And when a bear management unit, they expect that when you take this amount of bears out of that management unit, when those are gone, other bears will move from within the unit to fill that space. But if you've got this DNA research that says that, no, these bears aren't going to move to fill those spaces. These bears are related to these bears and they're going to stay in this area, whether it's a cultural learning that they're learning from their mothers, whether it's that there's enough food that they're going to stay there. But I also think it leads to some really interesting questions on why bears are moving to islands. We're running into really big food security needs. Bears must be running into really big food security needs. So is that why they're heading to islands? And I think that these conversations wouldn't come up unless it was a diverse group that's working on the research like this, the First Nations and Western science research. I think when we work together, it just brings up whole answers and questions that really wouldn't have come to light unless we were working together.
Yeah, it's wonderful. If anyone hasn't seen Jen's research paper, I think it was in the Globe and Mail. It's gotten international coverage. Very interesting. And I'm really looking forward to so many of you being part of this Indigenous Roundtable on grizzly bear conservation that we're going to host next week. And Richard is going to facilitate for us. To everyone who's still watching, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of why this is important, why we decided to add this to our mission, even though I've been working this way for over 20 years. I think it's important for the Grizzly Bear Foundation to recognize that and to show leadership to others, other organizations, businesses, government, that this is the way forward, that we need multiple solutions. We need a two-eyed seeing approach if we're going to solve this ecological and climate crisis. And if you believe in that work and what we're doing here at the Grizzly Bear Foundation with these great folks, please support our work tonight. I hope you had a great time. I hope you're cozy as I am. It's so nice to see all your faces. I can't wait to see you in person at an event in the future. And thanks again. We've got a little video to wrap up the evening to end it on a good note. And good night. Thanks, everyone.
During one of the most impactful global events in recent history, our connection to each other and to the natural world is more important than ever. You can help. You can ensure grizzly bears are never again hunted for their paws, hide, and head. You can give orphaned grizzly bear cubs a second chance at life in the wild. You can support conservation through reconciliation. You can help restore biodiversity. Give for Grizzlies today.